I turned 18 3 days before the 2016 election. This meant that, unlike most of my friends at the time, I had the privilege of voting. I was just in time to choose between the very publicly cucked wife of a former president, Hillary Clinton, and a newcomer to politics, an orange man with a bad attitude, Donald Trump. Lucky me. In November 2020, as the world was plunged into economic turmoil following the spread of COVID-19, the American people decided that in this time of great fear and uncertainty, the ship of state should be guided by a steadier hand. The polar opposite in temperament, Joe Biden was a folksy if unimpressive, doddering old man who would never, or was no longer capable of, so much as raising his voice. It seemed to everyone that the MAGA fever that gripped the nation had finally broke, that we had awoken from the long nightmare of the past 4 years and were once again heading towards a brighter tomorrow. Donald Trump, his tactics and policies would be relegated to the dustbin of history, an embarrassing detour in the otherwise inevitable march towards progress. Or so it seemed at the time. And finally, in November 2024, in a race that every expert, pollster, and news pundit expected to be a close 50-50 coin flip, Donald Trump crushed the ballot box and won every single swing state, stealing Grover Cleveland's only claim to fame by serving 2 non-consecutive terms as president. Poor guy. No more features in bar trivia night. But why? When the MAGA movement seemed to have its back against the wall, how did it surge forward to gain control of not just the presidency, but of every branch of government, achieving a level of consolidated power not seen by any party or administration in my entire lifetime? And what does the rise and fall and rise again of Donald Trump say about the state of democracy and politics across the globe and humanity's path along the great arc of history? These are the questions I will be attempting to answer in this video series. Our journey will take us through the realms of history, philosophy, political theory, culture, science, and economics. It will be a long and bumpy ride that I hope we can share together. But first, a few points I must address before we get started. First, I know there are a handful of you who, upon reading the title, immediately began furiously typing in the comment section, something to the effect of, "You idiot! Everyone knows why Donald Trump won. It's because Americans are racist." Or, "It's because Biden supports Israel." Or, "It's the economy, stupid." Or, "Mudang is secretly an eldritch deity of Lovecraftian proportion who, on the morning of November 7th, sent a psionic wave across the globe, swaying people to vote for the Republican candidate purely for her own sadistic entertainment." I find these answers insufficient. I have no doubt that in the future talking heads of all stripes will come out of the woodwork and say, Democrats lost because of wokeness, as the simple, clean answer as to why Kamala lost. Because that way, the mystery is solved, and any deeper analysis or self-reflection can be safely ignored. An effect rarely has just one cause, and anyone who claims to have the magic bullet answer that can be conveyed in a single sentence is deluding themselves. That's why the script for just one part of my answer is, Christ on a stick, 14 pages long. I will address many of these thought-terminating bad arguments in a separate video, but for now, we must soldier on. Second, let me say I am not making this video to bash Trump, though I will certainly not be pulling any punches either. If you're looking for Orange Man bad content, turn on Jimmy Kimmel. Or wait, is it Jimmy Fallon? Is there a difference?
Questions for later.
I think it is much more useful and important to understand Trump and what he represents so that history may not repeat itself. Though, I am pretty cynical when it comes to humanity's ability to learn from its own past. Thirdly, I am neither a historian nor political science expert by training nor profession. I will use data to make my points when appropriate, but almost everything in this video series is a narrative that I have constructed to make sense out of nonsense, to find a melody in the constant static noise that has and will continue to permeate public discourse. However, my political awakening coincides with Donald Trump's own rise in politics, and I thus feel almost uniquely qualified to give my opinions on this topic. And finally, I am making this video series mostly for my own sanity. If the only people who watch this are my mom and my editor's cat who fell asleep on the spacebar again, so be it. If, on the other hand, this video is being shown in a political science class in the year 2065, then hello everyone. How does the new flavor of Soylent Green taste? If America doubles down on its anti-intellectualism kick and starts burning books, then this video can serve as a record of the true origins of God Emperor Trump. My intended audience is everyone and no one. If my voice is but a whisper in the ether, then at least I know I tried. With all that out of the way,
let's just jump into it.
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill.
When you hear the word liberal, what do you think? If you're a die-hard Trump supporter, you might imagine a blue-haired millennial having an absolute meltdown over your abundant microaggressions. Or you think of a wealthy consultant sipping a Zinfandel from a crystal glass, gazing down from her Manhattan apartment at the peasants below. If you're a socialist, you might picture a group of naive sheep who should be gently guided away from the corrupting influence of capitalism so that they can see the truth. If you're a communist, you see the liberal as the bourgeoisie, the enemy that must be defeated to usher in collective ownership. And if you're a centrist, suburbanite soccer mom, you might conclude that the liberal, which you consider yourself to be, represents the normal American. Of course, your definition of what is normal is heavily skewed because it turns out Burbank, California is not a good statistical representation of all of America. What unites all of these definitions is that they have almost nothing to do with the original meaning of the word. My thesis is that Donald Trump can be understood not as the root cause of, but rather as a symptom of liberalism's demise. It is very important to not mistake the wrecking ball, tear it all down approach MAGA has to our institutions as the source of this decline. As I will show in this video, liberalism and the institutions we hold sacred in this country were on life support long before 2016. However, in order to understand how something dies, we must first examine how it is born. The Enlightenment was a philosophical and political movement popular among the European university educated from roughly 1685 to 1800. During this time, the perception of the world shifted from one governed by the laws and whims of God to one governed by natural laws that could be observed and understood. Thus, we as humans should abandon our superstitions, embrace rationality, and march forward, hand in hand, towards a future filled with knowledge and progress. To facilitate this future, instead of ideas and policy coming down from on high, we should debate and challenge each other in a kind of free-for-all battle royale, but with speeches and debates instead of... If every person is free to express their thoughts, then the best course of action will rise to the surface by being the hottest ticket in the marketplace of ideas. Or so the theory of liberalism goes. It is this fundamental ethos and the related ideas of freedom and democracy that form the bedrock of the American political system. Obviously this, along with many other points I make in this video, is an extreme oversimplification. But, well, you can see how long the runtime is, and we simply don't have time for the detailed breakdown of the entire history of Western philosophy that would be required for a deeper dive. I will be jumping frequently across time and space, and I apologize in advance for any whiplash this causes. Skipping over the Civil War and Gilded Age, we arrive at the critical moment of the 20th century, the end of the Second World War. Monarchies had fallen out of fashion since the end of World War I, and in its place rose the twin, secular, totalitarian ideologies of fascism and communism. While fascism had been dogpiled into submission by the unlikely alliance between the liberal powers of the US and UK and the communist USSR, the question arose, what to do with the lands and countries controlled by the former fascist regimes? And so a sort of experiment was carried out, the first of its kind in human history, where the continents and countries alike were divided up into a liberal and capitalist sphere and a totalitarian and communist sphere. In this way, the liberalism that defined the US was transplanted to places like Japan and Germany. This ushered in the era of liberalism as the most dominant political ideology globally.
I'm all lost in the supermarket.
Neoliberalism is one of those words that appears to be inserted into conversations that should have nothing to do with it, like AI or the Epstein files. The thought patterns and effects of neoliberalism are so omnipresent in our lives today that the concept itself is a bit difficult to define. If a fish lives its entire life in the ocean, how is it meant to understand water? The Oxford Dictionary defines neoliberalism as a political approach that favors free market capitalism, deregulation, and reduction in government spending. This definition is so broad as to be almost meaningless. But basically, neoliberalism seeks to cede the power held by the government and the marketplace of ideas to, well, the actual marketplace. A vote with $1 is much freer and fairer than a vote written on a piece of paper for some guy. This line of logic reached peak insanity when, in 2010, the Supreme Court ruled in Citizens United v. FEC that the artificial constructs of the market that we call corporations were legalistically citizens, and thus had every right to participate in the free market of ideas by donating functionally unlimited money to the politicians and policies that just so happen to benefit them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You, in the back of class, wake up! I know that we have really been getting into the weeds here. I promise. All of this relates to Donald Trump. We will get there. Stay with me. Figures like Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK became the champions of neoliberalism on the global stage. Speeches were given. Books were written about how government was actually the problem. And if we just released the shackles of regulation and taxes that were so burdensome to the company's bottom line, then our societies would become wealthy and prosperous beyond comparison. Oh, and the middle and lower classes who, actually did all the work? Don't worry. I'm sure the wealth will trickle down. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Now I could spend literal hours of my life just on Ronald Reagan and his merry band of Chicago school stooges, and perhaps one day I will. The key takeaway for now is this. The widespread adoption of neoliberal policies did indeed cause unprecedented global economic growth, but that growth was not appreciated by everyone equally. Look at this graph. What do you see? Before the Reagan administration, wage growth was mostly keeping up with rises in productivity. But since 1980 and the beginning of the free trade era, the gap has continued to widen. What this essentially means is your standard of living was barely improving, and since the pandemic and the resulting economic turmoil, it is now officially declining. Think back to the science fiction novels of your youth. By the 2020s, we were supposed to live in a Star Trek utopia with flying cars and powerful AI and robots to take care of all menial labor. Well, we have robots and we have AI, but has it made your life materially better? Are groceries or rent cheaper? Do you have more leisure time? Do you feel happier and more fulfilled? Or corporate profits reach record highs, the average American's budget is more strained now than at any other point in their life. This is the end point of trickle-down economics, and by some metrics, it has created the most unequal society in human history. Next graph. After the establishment of NAFTA in 1992, itself seems a massive victory for neoliberal policy. Manufacturing jobs in the US plummeted precipitously. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, since theoretically, these outsourced jobs should be replaced by jobs higher up on the value-added chain. The problem is that, in order to take advantage of these new jobs, the now unemployed workers would need to be trained how to use Microsoft Excel. And while federally funded job training programs did and do exist, they were too sporadic and too small scale to address the titanic shift in the labor market neoliberal policies caused. If you're from the Rust Belt states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, or Indiana, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The free market sounds great until it's your job at the Detroit car factory that gets shipped to the maquiladoras of northern Mexico. Hearing that your sacrifice made everyone in the world, on paper at least, a little bit more productive and efficient is a terrible consolation prize. Putting aside the moral implications of suicide nets installed on sweatshops in Bangladesh, this reorientation and globalization of manufacturing produced clear winners and losers. And the most insidious part of all of this is that they kept it hidden in plain sight. The data was out there, but unless you were an economist, why would you care to look? The only economic figure that mattered in the neoliberal worldview was that most sacred of numbers. All hail the GDP. As long as the line went up on graph, the negatives of the new economic paradigm could be safely ignored. Growth was all that mattered, because what was good for the economy was good for the people, the nation, and by extension, the entire world. This way of thinking is ingrained into every inch of our modern society. Why do movie studios make sequel after sequel and rarely risk big money on an original idea? Why do video game companies release half-finished unplayable garbage while collecting studios like they are Pokemon? Why did Boeing, who for decades was at the top of the aviation industry, outsource most of their production to the lowest bidder, resulting in public failure after failure, destroying their once spotless reputation and crashing their market value? It was all for the sake of that quarterly earnings report. As long as the trend line is positive and quarterly earnings increase, that's all that matters to the owners of these massive conglomerates. The long-term costs are irrelevant. This is obviously unsustainable, and there would be hell to pay when the bill came due. But all of this is said with the benefit of hindsight. For now, it's the 90s, and everything is sunshine and rainbows. The Soviet Union fell, which proved for many that the only proposed alternative to liberalism was not viable. Many of the former communist states were injected with a shot of market and political liberalization, and the holdouts like North Korea were so obviously economically unviable, they became the exception that proved the rule. The successes of neoliberalism and the American-led world order it created led Francis Fukuyama to declare the end of history had arrived. The theory went something like this. All humans strive to improve their lot in life, for themselves and for their children. This motivation is one of the fundamental forces that shapes every single society. Because communism had ultimately shown to bring economic stagnation, every country in the world would naturally choose capitalism as the preferred economic system. Capitalism works better the less authoritarian the government is. After all, what's the point of building a shoe factory if the government can just take it with no warning and for no reason? So, an increase in market freedoms would lead to an increase in political freedoms. This process would eventually force all governments to abandon isolationism, totalitarianism, militarism, and command economies in favor of global trade and an open political environment. The resulting boom in the global economy would end the need for wars fought over resources and land. Multinational organizations such as the EU and UN would foster peace among countries, who had more to gain from each other through trade than they could ever steal through violence. And therefore, history was over. Finished. Exit stage left. No more wars means empty pages in the future textbooks. The whole system was guaranteed by US naval hegemony, which everyone knew was untouchable. Again, in hindsight, we know what a fat load of BS this turned out to be. But at the time, people, especially people in the upper echelons of Washington, believed it. We cracked the code, they said. Discussions and debate over ideology were a thing of the past. Democracy was proven to be the best form of government, and capitalism the best economic system. All countries would naturally move towards liberalization, and nothing would ever change that. Right?
Some folks are born made to wave the flag.
Let's start with the first part of that alchemical equation that creates wealth and prosperity for all. Is democracy automatically the best political system, and can the new international pecking order force totalitarian governments to become democratic over time through osmosis? There was unfortunately a fly in the ointment. Some regimes decided to go rogue. They refused to play ball with the US and the UN and their silly rules for their silly game of global policeman. And no one ruffled the Americans' feathers more than Saddam Hussein. This, ultimately, is why the US invaded Iraq, twice, and not some children's fairy tale about weapons of mass destruction or Bush did 9/11. That sweet, sweet black gold that, by the way, is like the fuel that powers the entire system of global trade, oil make cargo ship go, got it? Was certainly enticing as well. If Iraq could be turned into an American puppet regime, the dino juice could be safely extracted and sold for a tidy profit. And Washington's geopolitical position in the region could be strengthened. So, a democratic puppet government of Iraq was established. The US assumed effective control and immediately purged the government and army of all people from Saddam's regime. That is to say, they fired hundreds of thousands of armed men who suddenly have no way of making an income in this new Iraq that was thrust upon them. So of course, many of them became terrorists, or fled the country, or were killed. The bodies piled higher, and the chaos rolled on. The biggest difference between Bush Jr. and Clinton lay in their foreign rather than domestic policy. Clinton believed the neoliberal formula should be applied through the pen rather than the sword, encouraging countries to voluntarily undergo the economic and political liberalization necessary for participation in the world that the end of history had created. He was all about coalition building and international cooperation. Bush, on the other hand, was a neoconservative. Now, the neocons believed in a lot of wacky things that we definitely do not have time to get into. But what matters for this story is they thought the neoliberal formula should be wielded as a cudgel, and countries could be beaten into submission if they resisted. And with 9/11 fresh in everyone's mind, it wasn't exactly hard to convince Americans of the need for war. As the years wore on, the American electorate began to have doubts about the story that we were told. The neoconservative ideology began to fall out of favor in Washington, to the point that in our time, Trump supporters use neocon as an insult. Many of the Republican congressmen who voted in favor of war still retain their seats after being subsumed by the MAGA movement. This is despite Trump, along with most mainstream political figures today, being an avid critic of the war. The answer to this paradox lies in a fun piece of revisionist history, extrapolated from Lyndon LaRouche's conspiracy theories, which spread in the war's aftermath. That it was not the fault of the American people or the conservative government and media apparatus for the Iraq debacle, but the deep state, or maybe the military-industrial complex. We were innocent angels, tricked into supporting the sinister globalist agenda and the regime change wars. While we were certainly lied to about the war's purpose, this argument strips us of our human agency. We were able to push the blame and responsibility onto an amorphous, faceless group of Washington insiders. In an attempt to run away from our guilt and avoid self-reflection, we accepted this narrative. There was, however, a side effect. The once respected institutions of the media, military, and government were called into question. The first seeds of distrust in the neoliberal political system had been planted. America's military, which formed the backbone of global commerce, was in fact not invincible. Thus, we have punched the first hole in the logic of neoliberalism. But where exactly did it all go wrong with Dick Cheney's little escapade? The problem is that you cannot force democracy onto a country, nor should you. Democracy is not the end-all be-all when it comes to governmental systems. This may be shocking to many of you, but follow along with me here. Does democracy in a country divided religiously between Sunni and Shia Islam, divided ethnically between Kurds and Arabs, with colonial borders thrust upon them, see the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, whose social structure is based on familial clan relationships, sound like anything other than an unstable nightmare of patronage and corruption? But these factors were brushed aside. Under neoliberalism, democracy was the only answer to the question, what form of government should we use? And so a democracy was established. This Frankenstein's monster of a country that's being slammed by economic forces they have never experienced, that's war-torn, devastated, not unified territorially, was clearly never going to be a functional nation state, much less a strong American ally in the region. Sometimes, on the sliding scale between freedom and security, it's better to keep the strong man in power if it means your neighbors won't bash your head in for worshiping Allah the wrong way. And if you remove that strong man and replace him with a weak and artificial democracy, well, the results speak for themselves. And so, the second hole in our logic appears. Democracy is not ontologically the best form of government for every society and every environment, and does not automatically lead a country towards peace, freedom, and prosperity. The neoliberal formula does not universally apply and cannot be forced upon those who choose to follow other ideologies and traditions. But hey, at least the economy is still good, right? The 2008 financial crisis is one of those turning points in history. If just a few different decisions had been made by those in power, we might have avoided Trump and his ilk altogether. Now, this is where people usually start playing the blame game, but the reality is more complicated. In a way, the Great Recession, just like the Iraq War, was all of our faults. We as a society bought into the neoliberal idea that prosperity would only increase, and markets would just grow endlessly. That the value of all this debt and all these assets would only go up and up and up and up and up and up. To the moon, to Mars! And why wouldn't we? The economy had mostly been one non-stop party since the 80s thanks to our old friend neoliberalism. Global economies had never been more interconnected, companies never as powerful, taxes as low, consumerism as rabid. The neoliberal transformation of America had truly been completed. And that's exactly why the whole thing blew up, right in everyone's face. The goal of any company is to make profit. Some of you may have just facepalmed at how obvious that statement is, but applying this rule teaches us an important lesson. Because all entities in a capitalist system are profit-seeking, they will not act in a way that is morally good. Whether you define good based on a set of principles or the utilitarian most benefit for the most people, it doesn't matter, they aren't doing it. So, to get them to behave, governments throughout history have imposed rules and regulations, so that all the trees in the forest aren't unsustainably chopped down to make toothpicks, or the industrial waste isn't dumped next to the elementary school. However, if you remember our definition from earlier, deregulation is one of the core goals of neoliberalism. Because hey, if all the chicken poop from the big chicken factory is flowing into the river, then people will naturally be upset, and the resulting fall in demand proves the free market works. Never mind that Big Chicken also owns the only newspaper in town, leading to an information disparity, or that it has a monopoly on all poultry in your country, making competition impossible. All the negative byproducts of this system, from pollution to demographic collapse, are given the collective name externalities. And because they are, well, external to the market, companies will never consider these factors unless forced to do so by government institutions. So, the safeguards and regulations, over the course of the 80s and 90s, were removed. The most consequential of these was the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, a law passed shortly after the Great Depression which separated commercial and investment banking. This would have prevented any bad investments from affecting the everyday consumer, and thus keeping a stock market crash from plunging the wider economy into a recession. But we live in a neoliberal world, and in a neoliberal world, regulations are always the problem, never the solution. The problem with the greed is good mentality is that greed is never satisfied. You can fill your dragon's hoard to the point where your average employee would require working 1,000,000 lifetimes to match you, but no mathematical or ethical law will tell you to stop. So why shouldn't you, the average everyday American, not take out a small loan to buy that jet ski you always wanted, or take a mortgage on your 5th home? No one else is being thrifty. Why should you? And this wasn't seen as a problem at all. In fact, quite the opposite. The economy was booming after all. And as long as the neoliberal axiom of infinite growth held true, then nothing could stop the good times from rolling on. Then, people began defaulting on their mortgages. Banks that had bet big on mortgage-backed securities lost billions. The stock market plunged. Companies folded. Unemployment spiked. No Glass-Steagall meant the damage spiraled out of control. The globalization of the economy caused by neoliberal policies meant the crisis spread everywhere. No one went unscathed. The question still remained, what should those in the seats of government do about this whole mess? Well, the traditional answer according to neoliberalism was nothing. If businesses were failing, it just meant they were unviable in the market and thus deserved to die. Remember, government intervention in the economy was bad news. The last time an economic crisis of this magnitude occurred, the American social contract was rewritten. The people were given a new deal, literally. But that is not what happened this time around. Instead, $500 billion were spent covering the debts of the wealthiest in society. It was a kind of reverse socialism, where the poor still had to play by the cutthroat rules of neoliberal capitalism and could expect no handouts. But the rich could now count on government intervention in the market if things got too dicey. And so, another flaw in the logic of neoliberalism was uncovered. Laissez-faire capitalism was not automatically the best economic system, and it could result in starvation, poverty, and misery. When push came to shove, the ruling class, rather than stick to their guns, decided to abandon neoliberalism in order to secure their own wealth and power. This makes the whole neoliberal project look, in hindsight, like a cynical cash grab rather than an actual ideology. In modern America, the Great Recession is rarely discussed, but it is important to remember that many countries, such as the United Kingdom, Greece, and Argentina, never recovered. Their GDP per capita and standard of living never again reached the heights enjoyed before the Great Recession. And so, people at home and abroad lost faith in the neoliberal world order. In America, though, we were still mostly in denial. 2008 was written off as an anomaly, not an inevitable consequence of our own excesses. Only one group of people were vocal about their displeasure: the participants in the Occupy Wall Street movement. And here we arrive at a critical juncture in our story, because here, for the first time, a group of people is openly preaching that neoliberalism has failed. The people's anger and resentment towards our financial and government institutions was growing, which would ultimately lead to the birth of new and powerful political forces. But first, we must ask the question: can we hope to change the current system, or will neoliberalism, and by extension, classical liberalism, be destroyed?
Obama! Obama! Obama!
Because we, the people, have remained faithful to the ideals of our forebears and true to our founding documents. So it has been, so it must be with this generation of Americans.
Go back and watch any speech Obama gave in the run-up to the 2008 election. What do you hear? Do you hear promises to cut everyone's taxes? To get the government out of business? To decrease the federal deficit? No. Instead, you hear appeals to democracy, progress, and America's founding fathers. Obama essentially took the position that the neoliberalism that had defined his party in the age of Clinton no longer had a place, at least when it came to domestic economic policy. If the cancer of neoliberalism could be cut away, then the liberal organism that formed the foundations of the United States could still be saved. By doubling down on classical liberalism, America could be put back on the right track. The system could be realigned and reformed along liberal principles. And people like this idea. Obama won in 2008 and again in 2012 against candidates who still tried to push neoliberal economic policy. But did anything fundamentally change? Did the system get a second wind? Obama and his supporters had big plans and bigger ideas about the direction they wanted to take the country. But through a combination of Republican stonewalling, political inexperience, and all institutions' natural resistance to change, this endeavor ultimately failed. Obamacare was so neutered, it was effectively useless as a public option for millions of Americans. Corporations continued to lobby for policy with impunity. Without the hyperconsumption inherent in neoliberalism, the economic recovery was sluggish. The hope that characterized the early years of Obama slowly turned to bitterness and resentment. And this, conveniently, brings us back to the beginning of our story, the 2016 election. So what do you do if you're one of the people disillusioned with the liberal political system? After suffering from deindustrialization and stagnant wages, after losing trust in the media, big business, and government, what was left? Hillary Clinton offered more of the same liberal platitudes Obama had used, without the sincerity that made it popular. Now, Hillary, Kamala, and the DNC will be the subject of a separate video, so I won't go into too much detail here. But to summarize, establishment Democrats and Republicans alike were still playing the game according to the rules of liberalism, leaving everyone unprepared when a new challenger took center stage. What do Viktor Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey, Nigel Farage in the UK, and Milei in Argentina all have in common. They are all some flavor of right-wing populist. Under populism, all policy issues are decided not based on what the citizens need or what will improve the country, but what people think they need and what sounds good in a media soundbite. Unlike liberalism, populism is a marketing strategy, not an ideology. Populism is much like a knife. It can be used to cut the plastic choking a baby sea turtle or to stab a policeman to death. It's all about how you wield it. Populism is not based on any principles. Besides vague allusions to the will of the people, there is nothing that ideologically unifies populists. Populism is irrational because people are irrational. Populism is emotional because people are driven primarily by their emotions. If it seems paradoxical to you that a movement which claims to be operating on behalf of the people can become opposed to democracy, good. That means you're paying attention. Under populism, the people are merely an excuse to enact, well, whatever policies the populist demagogue claims will help said people. In this way, populism is almost like a chameleon, able to change its color and ideas depending on the political environment it finds itself in. In America, this manifested on the political right as Donald Trump, and on the left as this piece of paper with Bernie Sanders scrawled in crown. The key difference is that Donald Trump was able to take over the right, while Bernie Sanders and his ideas have been effectively exiled from the mainstream left. 12% of Bernie supporters chose to vote for Trump, even though it went against some of their political ideas. This frames the 2016 election as a choice between status quo liberalism and populism, and thus, liberalism was dealt its death blow in America and, indeed, global politics. Since 2016, as populism has risen internationally, the democracy index of many developed nations has declined. Kamala Harris attempting to revive liberalism was like trying to perform CPR on a corpse, and this is ultimately why Trump won. In the choice between the decaying liberal institutions of the past and something new, people chose the latter. No matter how chaotic or destructive that new world will be, at least it will be different. With Trump's victory in 2024, I can say definitively that liberalism is dead, or is at least no longer the most dominant political force on earth. The liberalism versus populism divide explains so much about this most recent election cycle. It's why after the first and only presidential debate between the final candidates, both sides claimed victory. From a liberal perspective, the point of the debate was to argue policy positions in a logical manner better than your opponent, a task at which Kamala was clearly superior. However, from a populist perspective, the point of the debate was to articulate the struggles of the American people and be a better champion of their cause, which Donald Trump succeeded in doing. It explains why, despite being a coastal elite New York City billionaire, the very thing that people are supposed to hate, Trump is the chosen avatar of their rage, and is perceived to be on the side of the working class. Speaking of the working class, it explains how they were convinced to vote for the party that advocated and may continue to advocate for the undermining of the social safety net and the elimination of unions. This fact flies in the face of rational self-interest, Marxist class struggles, even simple game theory. The assassination of United Healthcare CEO was celebrated by people on the left and the right. Ben Shapiro tried to blame Luigi's universal popular claim on the radical left and was roasted for it in the comment section by his own supporters. The New York Times published an article where they unironically claimed Brian Thompson to be the real working class hero. The latter is the textbook definition of a liberal media institution, while the former is one of the few remaining right-wing pundits who still pays lip service to liberal principles. The populist support for this murder and the liberal rejection of it is a sure sign of the real political divide in this country. The data supports my story as well. Trump barely gained voters from 2020 to 2024, meaning comparatively few new people are being convinced by his rhetoric. With the plunge on the Democratic side, some 7 million votes represents the chunk of the voting public who has lost faith in liberalism, and I can't say I blame their lack of faith. So where does that leave us? Hopefully I've convinced you that the liberal political ideas codified in our Constitution by the Founding Fathers are no longer convincing to the majority of Americans. The framework and context this video has provided are just the beginning of our journey to understand how, just as the 80s were defined by Reagan and the 90s by Clinton, this era of American history is defined by Trump and his MAGA movement. Next up, we are going to spend some time going through the worst arguments I've heard to explain Trump's victory. And finally, if you're one of the unlucky few who remain on board the ship called liberalism after it has already hit the iceberg, the way I see it, you have three options. Surrender yourself to Trump mania, try and convince the mainstream Democratic Party to get on board with left-wing populism, or sing yourself a merry tune as you slip into the deep, dark ocean. Thank you so much if you made it this far. If you have thoughts or questions about anything I said, leave it down in the comment section below. Special thanks to my editor, Stell. I could not have done this without you. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and want to see more. I'll catch y'all on the flip side.